Hey guys, welcome to Chapter 11, Topic 3. This is our last topic in Chapter 11. I know that the progression of infection section was really long and intense, so if you need some extra help with progression of infection, please let me know. I'm here to help. It's really an important section, and these other two are more of supplemental sections for you. In this topic, we're going to talk all about the field of epidemiology, and this can be a really exciting career field, and if this interests you, I encourage you to pursue this, to look at it and see if maybe this might be either a backup plan to your current major choice, or if you have some other options out there, you can expand on what you're looking at for school. So why is this topic important? As healthcare professionals, it's really important that you understand how we track and understand how disease spreads. And this is exactly what epidemiology does. They are the disease detectives of the world. And this happens at a local, and a state, a national, and even a global scale. So here are our topic objectives for this chapter. Make sure you understand these. I know that some of them can be a little bit nebulous, especially because there are so many specific terms. So please let me know if you don't feel like you have a good handle on this vocabulary. So what is epidemiology? Epidemiology is defined as the study of the frequency and distribution of diseases. What does that mean? It means that we study how often and what kind of diseases are occurring where. So, here in Idaho, do we have a large number of breast cancers? Do we have a large number of syphilis cases? What is our breakdown in diseases, and how does that compare to other areas of the nation? Is there something that we need to be concerned about? Is there some kind of environmental cause that could be having this? Note that in comparison to normal medical practices, epidemiologists don't treat patients. They only track and observe. So they may come up with an answer that helps people treat patients, but they don't actually treat people. So here's some important terms in epidemiology that we need to get under our belts. The first of these is notifiable or reportable diseases. These are the diseases that must be reported to authorities when they are detected. And there's a variety of diseases that meet this reportable distinction. You'll see on table 11.11 in your book of all the ones in the US that are reportable. However, there are some states that require different reportable diseases. There may be more. So if there's, for instance, a really big occurrence of some kind of disease in a state, they may make that one reportable so they can track it. Now, these reportable diseases tend to either be very devastating diseases or they're easily spread, and so that's what makes them what helps set them up on these lists. But there's a variety of factors that can go into making these diseases reportable or notifiable. So now we have a couple of epidemiology terms we need to get straight. The first is prevalence. This is the total number of existing cases with respect to the entire population. This kind of gives us a sense of how prevalent or how frequent this disease happens within a given population. For instance, if you have 10 people in a small town and one person develops syphilis, that is a 10% prevalence, but it's still a little bit of a misnomer, whereas if you have 1 in 1,000, you have a significantly less level of prevalence. So it's important to understand that, but population size does make a difference. But it just kind of gives us a good guideline as to how things work, especially in a lower populated state like Idaho. Our prevalence rates may look slightly different than higher populated states. Now this is in comparison to incidences. And incidences are a snapshot of a time period. This is the key to an incidence, is it's how many cases we have over a specific period of time. If this number is high, then that means that we may be seeing an epidemic or some kind of outbreak. So that's where that incidence helps. So remember, incidence is a time point almost. It helps us look at a number of cases over a certain period of time. And then the last term is mortality rates, and this measures the total number of deaths due to a disease. So do we have a lot of people who die from syphilis in Idaho? What does that tell us? And that mortality rate, when we compare it to nationwide global scales, can help us see if there's something going on within our population that needs to be monitored, or if there's some way we can better help treat people if it's a disease that's not necessarily doesn't have a high mortality rate in other areas. Alright, so let's talk about the types of sources of infection. Now, whenever we start to see some kind of rise in disease, or in general we start to see some frequency or prevalency numbers come up, this is where we start to talk about these different types of epidemics that could be happening. The first of these is a point source epidemic. So this is where you have patient zero, or one single moment that exposed a whole bunch of people. This is called a point source epidemic. So this can then spread through a propagated infection. So if patient 0 spreads to 10 people and those 10 people spread to 10 people, that's how we get to a propagated epidemic. So you see how point source epidemic and propagated epidemic work together. Propagated epidemic can also work with common source epidemic, and common source is kind of something that happens over a period of time. And this tends to be something that's fairly environmental. So say a water source that is causing disease, or we have some kind of environmental attribute that people are getting sick from that it takes us a while to find. That can once again potentially become propagated if the infectious disease is communicable between people. So that's how that works. Now, common source epidemics are not always propagated, especially if we're talking about waterborne infections, things like that, but that's not always the case. So it's important to understand that just because it's a common source epidemic or a point source epidemic, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a propagated epidemic if it's not being spread. So make sure you have those three straight. I know it's a little confusing. So if you want to go over that again, just let me know and we can sit down and talk about that. So the last thing in this topic we need to look at are some types of occurrences. So these are some main patterns. So the first thing is endemic versus epidemic. And endemic is that normal prevalency level. You know, if we see that 10% of the population always has syphilis, that's our endemic level. When we have an endemic occurrence, that's when it's spread regionally. So there's a specific region of people that have a specific disease. So for instance, West Nile virus, you know, it's not going to be found in certain areas of the country, so that could be an endemic occurrence for the areas that do have West Nile virus present. So that's an endemic occurrence. It's regional, but it's the baseline levels that we always expect to see. This is in comparison to an epidemic occurrence. This is where we see raised rates in specific regional areas. So this is above the endemic level. And these can be from like a foodborne outbreak. So say the cantaloupe is contaminated with listeria or something like that. It could be sexually transmitted disease pockets that pop up. There's a variety of epidemic occurrences that can happen. These two are both regionally specific, endemic and epidemic, but then we have sporadic occurrences, and these can actually be the beginning of an epidemic, or they can just stay at sporadic and they just pop up and we don't really know how they all came into contact with each other. But these are where we just have random cases spread out across a large geographic area. So it's important to understand how that works. And then the last one is the pandemic occurrence. This is when we have multiple continents involved, not countries, but continents. When multiple continents are reporting epidemic levels, that's when we see a pandemic. So that's where we can see that happening. So it's important to note that if there's a raise in syphilis levels in Canada and the US, that does not mean it's a pandemic because we're on the same continent. It has to be more than one continent involved. So make sure you understand these patterns of occurrences, and if you want to go over them in class or at office hours, just let me know. This is the end of this topic lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions about any of these things, and as always, I'm available in my office hours or in class to answer any of these questions you have. And if you have any questions about that progression of infection section also, please let me know. Thanks.